out to everyone because of its value and importance in our industry. And who to bring this information to you, no other than Rob Sherberth, who's a senior trainer at Overton Safety. Rob, we appreciate you taking the time today away from your other activities to present to our group. We always find a tremendous value in the information that you share with us. I'm going to go ahead and turn the floor over to you, Rob. Thank you.
All right, Rhett, thank you very much. Let me share my screen here with you guys. It's great to be here. Man, I see some names and haven't seen faces, but some names I haven't seen in a long time. Haven't had the opportunity very often to sit in on this call because I'm always out teaching classes, but it was fantastic to have the opportunity to be here. And like I said, looking at the list of personnel on this call, looks like just over 100. See a lot of familiar faces and names, and it's great to see you and have this opportunity to communicate with you. So as Rhett said, I've been asked to do a short presentation, which for those of you that know me, short is not my middle name. So I'll do my best to keep it as short and simple as possible. I've only got 12 slides here just to keep me on track. And what we're really going to focus on today is the duties and responsibilities of the lift director and the site supervisor as listed in the WAC 296-155-53401, which are the duties of assigned personnel. There's a couple that aren't shown on this slide right here. Assuming you can see my slide, I was just going to ask. That was my next question. Somebody popped up and said, no.
Not yet, Rob.
Let me check share screen one more time. I had it, and then it went away. I don't know why it's so slow today. It's thinking. Not sure why it's not sharing. That's interesting. It's not popping up on the share menu. Rhett, can you unshare just to make sure that yours isn't?
Yeah, his is not on here, Rob.
Okay. It's interesting because I can see on my end, I can see the share. I just can't see. Like, oh, there it finally popped up. Here we go. It just took forever for that screen to pop up. Thank you for bringing that up. Appreciate you guys. All right. So anyway, duties of assigned personnel. Again, my name is Rob Sherbarth. As Rhett said, I'm the director for Overton Safety Training. I've been with Overton now over 20 years. My primary job now is to develop curriculum, make sure all of our instructional materials, whether it's forklifts or aerial work platforms, fall protection, or in this case, of course, cranes, rigging, lift director, is up to snuff, up to speed. So I've been very involved with the regulation process for cranes through Part L for all the way since 2007. And it's my pleasure to be here today. Today we're going to talk about hopefully you can see my screen now, the responsibilities of the site supervisor and the lift director specifically. I left a couple off the list here, the responsibilities of the crane owner and the crane user. These are all found in 53401. All of these are found in 53401 in separate subsections, with the newest, latest, and greatest addition being the disassembly director, which is a whole presentation in itself, as well as qualification requirements that have been added since September of last year. So for this presentation, we're going to focus on the job site, and that's really the management of the job site. So when you hear site supervisor, right, what do you think? Well, from a terminology perspective, OSHA has a formality. There's formal language in OSHA calling the site supervisor or the prime contractor responsible for the workplace the controlling entity. And ever since 2010, WAC was published in Part L, the controlling entity language did exist as the prime contractor. So as I look at some of the lists on the names here, I see Turner, I see R2, I see all these contractor names. Well, that's you, right? You are the controlling into when you are the prime contractor, a job where you have responsibilities for completion of the project. With this latest version of the WAC Part L being submitted, being promulgated, the term supervisor has completely placed the responsibilities of a control entity. Thus, you won't the term control entity accept the definitions used throughout the WAC, but instead you'll see site supervisor. And even as late as last week, I was out doing some training at a client's location, and they told me that they had a visit from one of our respected crane compliance officers that gave them a talking to and asked them for some very specific pre-lift meeting discussions related to cranes working in the area of each other. When one or more cranes or two or more cranes are working in the vicinity of each other, there's a requirement under the 53-400, line 39, I found that out, is the requirement to have a lift plan and a meeting to discuss how we're going to prevent contact. Somehow I missed that because it wasn't included in 53-401 site responsibilities. So some of these, this is a very condensed list, come from the duties and responsibilities of a site supervisor, but others are found throughout the rest of the WAC Part L as it applies to these responsibilities. So I just found a new one last week. So as you look through it time and time again, you might find there's something else I have to do. So what are your responsibilities? Who are you? The site supervisor, right? The foreman, the superintendent, the name on the banner, the sign, the name on the banner of the tower crane, whoever it is. This is the person who is ultimately responsible for the workplace. And in this case, since we're talking about crane-related activities, you're the person that must ensure that crane operations are being conducted and coordinated in accordance with the regulatory requirements, right? Which is, of course, the WAC. So I've just got some bulletized listings here of some of the site supervisor responsibilities, and hopefully I can get through this presentation, open it up if we have any questions, or what I'd really like to hear is any experiences that you guys have had recently as it relates to some of these requirements that are not the easiest things to satisfy from a compliance regulatory requirement. So I think the first thing I want to talk about here is the first bullet point. You, as a site supervisor, must ensure that we have a qualified lift director on site that is directly supervising lift operations. That literally means who is out there watching. Who's out there watching the crane, watching the rigging crew, watching the operation related to cranes, lifting, rigging, placing loads. We have multiple cranes on site. More than likely, you're going to have multiple lift directors per crane. Maybe even as we get into the responsibilities of a lift director, you might find we might have to have more than one lift director for any single activity simply because of the complexity of the lift and the coordination of that particular lift. But it is ultimately the site supervisor's job to ensure that each crane or each crane related activity is being supervised by a qualified lift director, right? And for those of you that aren't familiar with that responsibility, I'll cover it next under the 53-401 as well, but there are some qualification requirements for lift director that did change just a little bit in September, to where the lift director, instead of just being an assumed role based on expertise or qualification or assignment, designation, as OSHA calls it, but now the qualification requirements actually require some testing to include knowledge of crane-related activities, knowledge of the WAC, and prerequisites being met. So there are some requirements that must be met before you can assign somebody as a qualified lift director, and some qualification requirements you're going to have to ensure. So again, lift director assigned by the site supervisor. You, as the site supervisor, must ensure that all assembly, disassembly, and reconfiguration, you're going to see I've got it at the bottom of the slide here as the ADR, just to save some space on a PowerPoint. The assembly, disassembly, and reconfiguration is the new terminology that has been applied to any, of course, assembly or disassembly of a crane, to include mobile cranes or tower cranes on a job site. And they added the term reconfiguration to include climbing, to include adding jib, perhaps offsetting a crane that wasn't in a certain position, adding counterweights, changing configurations. There's multiple things listed under reconfiguration in the definitions section that would require an assembly disassembly director. So that's another new responsibility. The AD director has been listed in OSHA since 2009 when the OSHA Public Subpart CC was published in Washington since 2009 with Part L. But now again, there are some detailed specific qualification requirements found in 53303, specific that this person must be trained, must be tested, must have knowledge of employer procedures, must be present in all assembly, disassembly, and reconfiguration. So not only do you as a site supervisor have to make sure all the cranes on site are being supervised while lifting loads, but also while being assembled or disassembled or reconfigured. Along with that, you, the site supervisor responsible for your workplace, must ensure that the assembly, disassembly work zone is clear. Now, as it applies to tower cranes, this assembly, disassembly work zone has a new definition. The total area that the crane equipment and or components or attachments could reach if this crane or equipment were to collapse during the assembly, disassembly, or reconfiguration of a tower crane. Right? As you can imagine, we're talking about vertical heights affecting horizontal distances here. So as bullet 2 says here, the height of the crane, the length of the boom or jib, the attachments and loads, all shall be considered in order to calculate this area. This area can shrink or grow as the work progresses. So what are you supposed to do? Close the city, right? Shut it down? Well, kind of, maybe. This definition in 53.4, this is in 400, this is under the general requirements of the work zone. And this work zone includes either the load, if you're lifting, placing loads, or the crane components during assembly, disassembly, has the potential to swing over an area that the public can enter. The site supervisor must ensure, must provide, and it does say, when possible, to the extent allowed by jurisdictions, road closures, sidewalk closures, signal and flagging as applicable. I've driven many job sites where we have our off-duty police officers, or we have our barrier control persons in place that are controlling entry and access and street use as it applies to construction. Now we're talking about an area that might grow exponentially as we talk about a crane growing from ground to vertical with a jib in a dense population, or in this case, a city is where most of our tower cranes are being used. So it's a pretty significant role and responsibility. And this is the area for those of you that are on the steer, how you're handling this. If anybody's had a tower crane assembly, disassembly, reconfiguration recently and had to deal with Seattle or Bellevue or Kirkland or any of these areas, at the end, it'd be great to hear a success story if there is one. So much, if they choose to do this in the future. Additionally, when lifting over an occupied building, a plan to minimize public exposure must be developed and utilized prior to beginning lifting. So just as a review here, this statement that's on the screen comes directly out of the WAC. It applies to the load when lifting, placing, and moving loads. It applies to the crane equipment or crane component during assembly, disassembly, or reconfiguration. So here, you can see the slide. Anytime you're doing tower crane work, you're going to have to submit a permit to the department, to DOSH, at least 20 days prior to any tower crane assembly, disassembly, and reconfiguration. And that permit process is going to include your plan to control access according to the information in the previous slide. So how are you controlling street access? How are you controlling public access? What are you doing as it relates to adjacent buildings where crane components or loads may be suspended? What is your plan as it applies to that? So this permit, as of December of last year, this just became effective. Must be submitted a minimum of 20 days prior to any tower crane assembly or disassembly or reconfiguration work. Additionally, one of the additional responsibilities under the site supervisor is to ensure that a technical representative of the distributor or manufacturer of the tower crane is on site. Typically what will happen here, and this is sort of a conjoined responsibility with the assembly disassembly director, is the site supervisor is going to hire and coordinate activities with an assembly director. The assembly director, meaning your tower crane assembly personnel that we know out there in the industry, are going to work with, for example, Northwest Tower Crane is going to work with Morrow. They're going to have a technical representative to support Liebherr. And so the whole process is being managed not much differently than it has been in the past, but now it's a legal obligation that the site supervisor coordinate all of this activity, ensure the permit is being applied for. All of these just crane will is this person from Morrow is on site as the technical representative, and this person from the Tower Crane Erection company is on site, and all of these personnel have been assigned by name that are part of this permit and assembly, disassembly, or reconfiguration process. So it's a very large scale coordinated effort between site supervisor, assembly director, and the actual installers, the assembly, disassembly team that's going to be working to install or assemble, disassembly. Assembly disassembly activities apply to all assembly disassembly, not just tower. It also applies to mobile cranes where we have to build a crane on site with pinning boom components, pinning sections of cranes together, counterweights together, jibs if they're not swing away. One of the things I am pretty happy with that came out with this most recent version is assembly disassembly has been defined clearly. So has setup. Since setup is now defined as setting up a crane on outriggers in configuration, swinging away a flyaway jib, changing line configurations, preparing the crane for operation. Since setup is now clearly defined, there are some tasks that may have been considered assembly disassembly in the past that are no longer included. But if it doesn't meet within the scope of setup, such as pinning boom sections together, bringing in supplemental counterweights to add counterweight to the crane, those types of activities, then the site supervisor still has to make sure that we have an assembly director, an AD director that's qualified, that is overseeing the assembly and disassembly of that crane. And a lot of times it's going to be the crane company that provides that crane on site that's going to be providing those resources, whether it's the assembly director or perhaps the lift director as well in those activities. So again, site supervisor is responsible to put all this stuff together. To the extent that the site supervisor is responsible ultimately for the entire workplace, as makes sense. The site, the ground, traffic control, work zones, and as a bullet point now under the responsibilities of a lifter or of a site supervisor includes the responsibility to display the names of all these assigned persons for review on the job site when cranes are in use. So every single shift might require updating. We have to display the name of the site supervisor that has met the requirements or is meeting the requirements per this rule. The assigned lift director or lift directors, multiple, assembly directors, riggers, signal persons, and operator or operators for the entire duration that the equipment is on site. There is a slight exception for that, and that would be for delivery. Cranes that are exclusively delivering products. That won't include your drywall crane that's actually suspending, holding, and unloading. It would only include a crane that's being used to unload to the ground in no specific arranged sequence or placement of the load. So the definition of delivery is pretty clear. So if it's a delivery crane, you don't have to follow that bullet point. Otherwise, you must have a listing that displays who's responsible for each crane in operation, who's your lift director, your operator, your qualified rigger, your qualified signal person. That's a lot. And this is just a condensed version of site supervisor responsibilities. So again, to prevent regulatory fatigue, I know the rules inside and out from a regulatory perspective, and I still find things every day that are new, that are different. Somebody asks a question, I look it up, I find something. There are additional requirements to create a plan, document a plan, review the plan with all persons involved, which includes documentation of meetings if you had a plan. So if there's a plan, there better be a meeting. If there's a meeting, there needs to be documentation. And then, of course, execution of the plan correctly. What are some situations I've found? If cranes could collide with each other. So cranes within radius of another crane, we have a documented plan to include a meeting with documentation to include who is involved in that and the steps that are being taken. If a critical lift is being performed, and if you really read the definition of a critical lift, it's really beyond the lift activities. Any hazards that go beyond a normal planned lift, it would be and could be and might be considered a critical lift. We have the two by definition, exceeding 75% of capacity or two cranes lifting a load. But the definition of a critical lift brings a lot of other things into the possibility of a critical lift plan as well. If we're lifting personnel, there's going to have to be a plan. That plan requires documentation and supervisor supervision and all the steps to be followed. Anytime you work in the vicinity of power lines, states don't really know with some documentation. There's 6-7 pages available. If you don't have a copy of that, I can put it in the chat session at the end, a link to it. But the state's done a real nice job of creating. There's an online, I hate to call it an app, but it's an online process that you can follow when working in the vicinity of power lines, some steps that should be followed. And there's a link within there to some forms that can be used and filled out as part of this plan for the documentation involving power line proximity. So there are some tools out there. There's some tools out there for sample lift plans. There's some tools out there. The state actually also has a personnel lifting sample plan in the back of the regulations as well. So some of these tools exist. If you don't have them already, they're accessible through .gov into construction cranes, and then go into the resources tab within there. So again, that is just site supervisor responsibilities, and it's a very condensed version of the list. There are about 17 bullet points within the site supervisor responsibilities, and again, there are several that are found throughout other places within the standard. Now let's move on to lift director. The lift director is the person, quite frankly, that's actually going to do everything we just talked about. So while the site supervisor is responsible to ensure it is being done, the lift director is the one that's going to do. So quite frankly, I just summarized, the lift director is the person that's going to ensure that everything the site supervisor has to do is done. Typically, the lift director is the one that will be doing it. What will you be doing? You will be directly overseeing lifting operations. The lift director must address any safety concerns and decide what to do. There is a difference between a competent person as a person who can identify a hazard with the authority to take action, and a qualified person, a person that has the ability to solve or resolve a problem. I find in doing lift director classes and lift director training, there's an awful lot of expectation being put right back on the crane operator or the rigger, or maybe even a signal person at a job site to fulfill the obligation, the roles and duties of a lift director without the knowledge, without the experience, without the ability to make decisions as to what to do. Now, it doesn't exempt them from having the opportunity to reach out to others. If that lift director on site is undecisive, they're not sure what to do, they want to call their employer, they want to call a subject matter expert, they want to call the state, a consultant, absolutely within their purview to do so. Makes a lot of sense if they don't have the answers, to find the answers and to stay shut down until that point. But again, I'm finding by doing these classes, and the more and more we do them, the more it appears as though, especially with small contractors, that this expectation is being placed on the operator, which unfortunately was the entire reason that ASME created this position quite a few years ago, is to create separation between operator responsibilities and oversight. In some cases, it might make sense. In other cases, it absolutely doesn't. From a site supervisor point of view, it's going to have to be your decision if this lift director is qualified to perform the responsibilities based on their qualification requirements, but also if they're in a position to do their job effectively. From a lift director point of view, you have to personally decide, am I the right person for this job? Am I the person that should be overseeing this operation? Can I, the words above, directly oversee the lifting operations being performed? And how that's interpreted is within sight. Oversight is not in an office, it is present, being present during that operation. So there's a lot of argumentative debate between those statements. Directly oversee as in within line of sight, is that physically possible if we have a lift director on the ground when we're setting loads and 5 stories high? Does a person have to be on the roof? Do they have to oversee the signal persons? Do they have to oversee the rigging? Do they have to oversee every single aspect? Or is it a bigger global oversee? My experience and my discussions with certain persons in experience with citations, as well as some of the consultation, is if the lift director is not physically capable of being present to coordinate activities between operators, riggers, and signal persons, then they're not in the right place. And it's very difficult for an operator to be at the controls of the crane and directly overseeing rigging and signaling operations, if not impossible in some cases. Additionally, lift director must follow the plan, right? If we created a plan, there is a plan. The lift director's job, not necessarily to create a plan, but to follow the plan, conduct the meetings, and document the process. Also, qualified. Ensuring qualified, meaning certified and evaluated persons to correctly perform their duties. Now, certification only applies to operators currently. One thing you may notice is with the assembly disassembly director responsibilities, starting in January of 2027, any assembly disassembly directors that oversee tower crane assembly, disassembly, or reconfiguration must also be certified through an accredited certification process. For now, qualified meaning trained, tested, evaluated to correctly perform their duties. So do we have a qualified operator? Certified means, in this case, they've been tested through a accredited organization, and they're actually doing their job correctly. How are our riggers qualified? Are the signal persons qualified? Are all persons qualified? That's the lift director's job to ensure that is the case. In addition to these standard around to ensure that the lift director is involved and understands active wind conditions and weather conditions, and must prohibit crane operations if wind exceeds manufacturer's limitations. There are other statements within the rule that says something to the effect of, and also if the wind is predicted to exceed limitations, operations must be suspended until the predicted wind speed meets the manufacturer's limitations. So not only knowing the present conditions, but anticipating conditions and predicting conditions based on information you have available to you as a lift director. Knowing and providing load information to the operator and ensuring the load will not exceed limitations. So our lift directors shouldn't just be persons of supervisor authority, supervisory personnel. They also need to be persons with technical experience that can actually provide information, communicate effectively with operators and riggers, ensuring they understand their loads, they understand the dynamics of their loads, and they understand that these loads will not exceed limitations as part of a lift plan or a traditional lift. And last but not least, again, since this is a condensed list of duties, ensuring special lifting operations are being done safely. These might require a written plan, and dare I say critical, because in some cases, if it is a risk that must be handled beyond normal, that's terminology that's used in the definition, it may be a documented lift plan. Lifting operations naturally does involve a documented lift plan. Pick and carry operations, meaning on-rubber operations or moving with a load, doesn't necessarily meet the definition of a critical lift or even a special lift unless other hazards are introduced to the process. But you are following a special chart under special conditions. And the challenge there is the ground conditions. It's easy to ground conditions for crane exposition. It's much more difficult if that crane is in motion. Multiple load lifting. This is a new addition to the rule as well. The steel erection standards within the WAC are still in existence for structural steel loads to include up to 5 items that must be lifted or rigged independently. But there was no guidance, there was no leadership, there were no regulatory requirements for anything other than structural steel. So, quite frankly, there was some abuse out there where multiple loads were being lifted correctly, but in excess because there was no standard. Now the law specifically addresses this under the rigging standard, and we are now restricted to a maximum of 3 items to be rigged independently that are non-structural steel. So bundles of lumber, bundles of ISO, trusses, individual things that are being lifted by multiple lift rigging apparatuses. Structural steel, we're limited to a maximum of 5 items. Non-structural steel, we're now limited to a maximum of 3 items that are rigged independently. So that is a new addition to the rule. Putting a mobile crane on a barge is definitely a special lifting operation that might require a documented plan and perhaps even beyond that. And the other thing that was just added is lifting with vacuum lifters, close proximity magnets, or grapples. The thing about these 3 lifting devices is they all rely on some other method of load control, right? We have to have power to have a vacuum lifter maintain vacuum. We have to have good surface conditions and good magnetism for a magnetic lifting device to properly grip the load. And for grapples, there has to be positive load, positive application, or that grapple could release that load. So these lifts were added to the special lifting operations section under both the site supervisor and lift director responsibilities to ensure that these special operations are being conducted correctly, safely, and within the equipment's limitations. So again, as I mentioned, this is just a real small condensed list of responsibilities from site supervision to lift director. Like I said, I would love to hear if there were any experiences, any opportunities that any of you have had out there specifically related to these responsibilities. If anybody wants to share anything based on their experiences that they've had recently, that would be fantastic. Or if you have any other questions, I'd be happy now to answer them.
Boy, Rob, that was a great presentation as always, and I'm sure many people are going to ask for this information in PDF format. Is that something that can be available to them?
Correct.
Excellent. I do have a question with regard going back to the lift director responsibilities. You know, for years it had mentioned that the lift director did not have to oversee every lift. So now that is being switched back to where they do have to oversee every lift. Is that I know that ASME originally said that they have to oversee every lift, and then it was nixed and said no, that was the rigger's responsibility, and that the lift director just had to be available on site. But now that is rolling back into where the lift director actually has to observe every single pick. Is that accurate?
Gee, I see a guy on this call. It would be a wonderful person to answer it.
Is it Bill? I think
I have his emails that would validate it, but yeah, I'd rather he did.
I think Bill, if he's on board, Bill, we'd love to hear from you on that one. And I think he mentioned that he might had to jump ship about midway through, but maybe I'm wrong. Bill, are you still there?
I think he did jump ship.
Yeah, he jumped. So, and I've talked with Austin quite a bit as well. Austin Shealy. So as a compliance consultant, I believe is his term. His job responsibilities about this. He actually sat through a lift director class, and we had a lot of dialogue and discussion about this. And the fact of the matter is, nowhere independent director in an orientation to how can that be possible if the person isn't present, right? So how can a single person directly oversee multiple applications? Now, if the word directly wasn't included in the definition, right, that would be different. But as I think it was Chase made a comment here, lift director's duties be present and oversee lifting operations. It's from old language. The new, it does say the word directly oversee in the responsibilities section or in the definition, I believe it is. So the way that that has been interpreted to me is physically present and in control of that operation. It's a very difficult thing to do as an operator. Quite a few questions in the chat. I didn't keep up with the chat as I was going. It always distracts me. But I see quite a few comments. Can the operator lift director be the same person? It depends, right? If it's a remotely operated crane, heck yeah. If it's a cab operated crane that's 300 feet away from the load placement position, how is that person directly overseeing the work? Now, my personal belief is if that lift director's job is to ensure a qualified lift director, a qualified rigger, and a qualified signal person are both jobs doing their job independently, that person, the lift director, did their job. They assigned persons to oversee the operation. But the word directly coming into the equation throws a little snag in there to imply something of physical presence.
Yes, you're absolutely right. That definition of oversee is to supervise, manage, or be responsible for making sure something is done, and that could be to, watch over or direct a task or group of people to ensure that it's completed, and then directly oversee does change the definition to personally supervise or monitor something without intermediaries. So that is a very, very key word in that definition, and that's thank you for clarification on that, because I think a lot of folks have put a lift director responsibility maybe on a site superintendent or a lead or somebody who's directing work. as that supervisor who would ensure that those qualified persons are in positions to complete those tasks. But adding that directly changes the game and changes the definition overall. And that brings me to another point. Brittany Savage brought up a question. She's with Apollo, and she says, "Can the crane operator and lift director be the same person if they hold the same qualification?" And Rob, I know you touched upon this, but it relates to that directly oversee. If you got somebody in the crane cab, they're probably not going to be able to see the exact hitch or process of rigging or be on the ground, boots to the ground, where they're overseeing it, especially if they're elevated, say in a tower crane or bird's eye view. Is that accurate, or can you speak a little bit more to that for clarification, please?
That is definitely how it has been explained to me as well.
Copy
Is
that.
difficult, not impossible, but difficult, especially if, I could see a knuckle boom operator, a boom truck operator that's in total sight, their complete vision of the load from lift to set, that could possibly perform both responsibilities. But as soon as we go over a parapet, as soon as we're on a blind pick, as soon as we're over an edge, how is that possible? And again, as well as I do, everybody knows if the execution of the process is perfect, if it's flawless, if the signal persons are wonderful, if the rigging is done correctly, if everything is performed perfectly as expected, there are no issues, right? There's no hazards, there's no risks. Everybody did their job perfectly. It's when something does go wrong, and now we have to question, was that lift director directly overseeing the work from a position they were capable? They were in the right place. And that's where the question, unfortunately, makes it very challenging.
Certainly. Thank you. Other
And yeah,
questions,
and,
please.
and Chase did mention, of course, yes, lift director requirement, prerequisites, you must be a qualified rigger, maintain that qualification, must be a qualified signal person, maintain that qualification, as well as being trained and tested specifically as a lift director. Those are the prerequisites. I was in the middle of, somebody mentioned that under the responsibility. So under 53401, it does not use the word directly. It just says oversees the work, but it's in the definition. So I'm about to cut and paste it here for you guys. So
Thank you for that.
Hey,
And
Brett,
yes,
question. Rob Scott here, JTM Construction, and this question is more for awareness, not to scare any, along those lines, but question regarding legal liability potentially going forward with the new laws. So the question would be, where does legal liability transfer, or where could it lie if a person credentialed and evaluation? More definitively, it would be the controlling contractor, but can individuals also now become liable for mistakes?
to the best of my knowledge, this is a no-fault state, and an employee cannot be. I mean, you could certainly be involved in, in court processes, but cannot directly be impacted unless there was something that went above and beyond willful negligence. This would always go back to the employer in those situations, and anybody has the opportunity to speak to that. But it is a no-fault state with regard to, and that might be the improper terminology. If we have any attorneys in here, I'm certainly not an attorney, but it typically in this state goes back to the employer, unless you are an owner operator and you have that credential and you are out there, boots on the ground, and an incident occurs that results in a catastrophic impact. But maybe, Rob, do you have any input on that as well? Can you piggyback on that? Oh, you're muted, bud.
no, I would respond the same as you. I'm not as up to speed on that little personal. So negligence is negligence, right?
Yeah.
And
yeah.
there are
great-
absolutely precedent where negligence, gross negligence, and negligence could be personal liabilities, even criminal, right?
Yes, so nope, great response, gentlemen. Again, had a little information on that, so it was a pointed question, but appreciate the clarification.
Yes, sir. Other questions for Rob, or just interject